Who is the greatest baseball player of all time? It sounds like the easiest question in sports. Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, maybe even Shohei Ohtani. But the second you actually try to answer it, the entire argument falls apart. Because baseball has one problem no other sport does. Every era played a different game. So today, instead of asking who had the most home runs, we're going to figure out who's actually the best baseball player that ever lived. So where do we start? Most people think they already know the answer. Just compare the numbers. Who hit the most home runs? Who has the highest batting average? Who won the most MVPs? Problem solved. Except baseball has spent the last 100 years proving that almost every one of those numbers is flawed. Take home runs. On paper, it seems obvious. Hit the ball or the fence more than anyone else, and you're probably the greatest hitter ever. But then you remember Barry Bonds played in the steroid era. Babe Ruth played before integration. Aaron Judge plays in an era where pitchers throw harder than ever before, and the dead ball era stars were lucky to hit 10 home runs in a season. Suddenly, the same number means 4 completely different things. Okay, maybe batting average is the answer, except it treats a single exactly the same as a home run. A player who goes 3 for 10 with 3 singles has a better batting average than someone who goes 2 for 10 with 2 home runs. One of those players created 4 runs. The other barely moved the needle. So maybe batting average isn't telling the whole story either. Fine, let's use championships. Except baseball isn't basketball. One player can't drag an entire roster to a World Series. Mike Trout spent the first decade of his career playing like an inner circle Hall of Famer, and made the postseason exactly 1 time. Meanwhile, role players have multiple World Series rings simply because they happen to be on dynasty teams. If championships define greatness, then are we really saying those role players had better careers than Mike Trout? Probably not. So maybe awards are the answer. Except MVP voting is done by people. People have biases. People get things wrong. Sometimes voters fall in love with a great story. Sometimes they punish players they don't like. Sometimes they reward the best player. Sometimes they reward the player on the best team. The criteria changes almost every year. So even the awards aren't objective. That's why modern fans love WAR, wins above replacement. It's baseball's attempt to combine everything a player does into one number. Hit, field, run, throw. Do all of it well, and WAR rewards you. It's probably the best single statistic we've ever created, but even WAR isn't perfect. Different websites calculate it differently. It has to estimate defensive value, something that's incredibly difficult to measure across baseball history, and it compares players from eras where the game itself was completely different. In other words, the smartest baseball statistic is still making educated guesses. Every number tells part of the story. None of them tell the entire story. And that's what makes finding the greatest player in baseball history so difficult. Because before we compare the players, we have to figure out what greatness actually means. Imagine this. It's 1927. You step into Yankee Stadium and watch Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs. The crowd goes insane. Newspapers call it the greatest season everyone has ever witnessed. And honestly, they weren't wrong. But there's one question almost nobody asked back then. Who wasn't on the field? Because while Babe Ruth was dominating Major League Baseball, some of the best players in the world weren't even allowed to play in it. Not because they weren't talented enough, but because baseball had drawn a line that had nothing to do with talent. For decades, black players were forced to play in the Negro Leagues, creating an entirely separate baseball world filled with legends who never got the chance to face Babe Ruth in a Major League game. When Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, the talent pool didn't suddenly get better, it just got bigger. And that changed everything. The average player became better. Competition became deeper. Getting to the major leagues became harder than it ever had been before. But integration was only the beginning. The game itself never stopped evolving. In the early days of baseball, starting pitchers were expected to finish what they started. A lineup might see the same pitcher 4 or even 5 times in one game. Today, a hitter might face a flamethrower starter throwing 98 miles an hour, followed by a left-handed reliever, then a submarine pitcher, then a closer throwing 102. Every at-bat is a new challenge. Then came expansion. 8 teams became 16, then 24, then 30. More roster spots meant more opportunities, but it also meant talent was spread across the league in ways it had never seen before. Travel changed, training changed, nutrition changed, video changed, analytics changed. Pitch design became a science. Teams started measuring everything: spin rate, launch angle, exit velo, release point. There are pitchers today who know exactly how a baseball needs to spin to move 1 extra inch. 1 inch. That's the level of precision modern baseball has reached. So when someone says Babe Ruth would hit 100 home runs today, or Barry Bonds would struggle in the 1920s, they're not making an argument. They're making a guess. Because none of us truly know. We can't transport players through time. We can't erase a century of changes. And that's why every GOAT debate eventually turns into an era debate. Not because one generation of players was necessarily better than another, but because they were playing completely different version of the same sport. So if comparing eras is almost impossible, how do we decide who's actually the greatest? We stop comparing the eras and we start comparing the players. Now that we've established one thing, there is no perfect statistic, and there is no perfect era. We're left with one question. What actually makes someone the greatest player of all time? Because if the answer was just home runs, this video would have been over 5 minutes ago. If it was championships, half the greatest players in history wouldn't even be in the conversation. So instead of trying to prove someone is the greatest, let's start by proving who isn't. And that eliminates a lot of names. Ted Williams, arguably the greatest pure hitter baseball has ever seen. The last player to hit over 400 in a single season. A strike zone so good that pitchers eventually stopped challenging him altogether. But baseball isn't just hitting. Williams was never known for his defense, and he lost nearly 5 full seasons serving in 2 wars. While those years were beyond his control, we're evaluating complete careers, not hypothetical ones. So as incredible as he was, he falls just short. Then there's Rickey Henderson, the greatest leadoff hitter ever, the greatest base runner ever. More stolen bases than anyone in history. More runs scored than almost anyone who has ever played. He turned a walk into a double without ever swinging the bat. But despite all of that, Rickey simply doesn't have the all-around resume of the names still standing. Then there's Mike Trout. For nearly a decade, he looked inevitable. 3 MVP awards. Season after season where he was simply better than everyone else. If his career had continued on that trajectory, the conversation might already be over. But baseball doesn't reward what could have happened. It rewards what did happen. And injuries have kept Trout from building the kind of longevity that almost every all-time great needed. Then there's Shohei Ohtani. Maybe the most unique player baseball has ever seen. A legitimate ace. A legitimate MVP hitter. Doing something nobody thought was possible in the modern game. Every night he takes the field, he does something we haven't seen since Babe Ruth. And in many ways, he's doing it at an even higher level because he's doing it against modern competition. But greatness isn't measured over 5 seasons. It's measured over 15 or 20. And until Ohtani has time to build that legacy, his story is still being written. So after all of that, who's left? Not 20 players, not 10, just a handful. Those players whose greatness survived every era, every statistic, and every argument. Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, and Barry Bonds. 4 players, 4 completely different careers, 4 completely different definitions of greatness. And somehow, only one of them can be called the greatest baseball player who ever lived. Hank Aaron. If there's one player that almost nobody argues against, it's Hank Aaron. No scandals, no controversy, just greatness. For 23 seasons, Hank Aaron was baseball's definition of consistency. He didn't have one magical year, he had 20. 755 home runs, more than 3,700 hits, over 2,200 RBIs, 25 All-Star selections. Year after year, no matter who the pitcher was or what decade it was, Hank Aaron produced. In fact, if your definition of the greatest player ever is simply the one who gave his team the best chance to win for the longest period of time, you could stop the video right here. Hank Aaron has an incredible case, but this isn't a debate about the greatest career. It's a debate about the greatest player. And those aren't always the same thing. When we look at every player still standing, one thing starts to become clear. Each of them has something that fundamentally changed how we think about baseball. Babe Ruth didn't just hit home runs, he reinvented offense. Willie Mays wasn't just great, he became the blueprint for the complete baseball player. Barry Bonds reached an offensive peak so unbelievable that pitchers would rather put him on base than risk letting him swing. Hank Aaron never had that defining claim. He was almost never the most feared hitter in a single season. He never had Ruth's revolutionary impact. He never had Mays' combination of elite offense, defense, and speed. He never reached Bonds' untouchable peak. Instead, he was simply excellent every single year for more than 2 decades. And maybe that's even harder to do. But when we're trying to identify the single greatest player who has ever lived, consistency alone isn't enough to be the greatest. You have to separate yourself from history, not just survive it. And as unbelievable as Hank Aaron's career was, I don't think he separates himself from the remaining players quite enough, which means our field shrinks again. 3 players remain: Babe Ruth, Willie Mays, and Barry Bonds. Nobody dominated his era like Ruth. He basically invented power hitting. He retired with more home runs than entire franchises. But the greatest player ever shouldn't have spent his entire career in a segregated league. If aliens landed on Earth and asked you to build the perfect ball player, you'd accidentally invent Willie Mays. Power, defense, arm, speed, leadership, longevity. But being the most complete ball player isn't always the same thing as being the greatest. Before steroids, Barry Bonds was already one of the greatest baseball players ever. Gold gloves, MVPs, walked with the bases empty, the bat on his shoulder. Pitchers were terrified. But if steroids erase everything, where exactly do we erase it? After everything we've looked at, I'm not sure that question has a real answer. Because every time we think we've found one, baseball changes the rules. If you value dominance over your own era, it's Babe Ruth. If you believe the greatest player should have no weaknesses, it's Willie Mays. If you think the highest peak matters more than anything else, you probably choose Barry Bonds. And if your definition is longevity and consistency, you might still choose Hank Aaron. None of those answers are wrong, they're just answering different questions. Maybe that's the problem. We've spent decades arguing over who the greatest player is, without ever agreeing on what greatest actually means. Is it the player who changed baseball forever? The player with the best stats? The player who could do everything? Or the player who was simply better than everyone else for the longest time? The truth is, baseball doesn't give us a way to separate those ideas. Every generation plays a different version of the sport. The talent pool changes, the rules change, the equipment changes, the strategy changes. Even the baseball itself has changed. So when we compare Babe Ruth to Willie Mays, or Willie Mays to Barry Bonds, we're not really comparing players. We're comparing completely different versions of baseball. And maybe that's why this debate has lasted for more than a century. Not because baseball fans are stubborn, but because there isn't enough evidence to prove anyone right. Every argument requires an assumption. Every statistic has context. Every resume has an asterisk. The farther back you go, the harder the comparison becomes. Maybe the greatest player in baseball history isn't something we can discover. Maybe it's something we choose. A reflection of what we value the most in the game. Because when someone says Babe Ruth is the greatest, they're telling you they value dominance. When someone says Willie Mays, they're telling you that they value completeness. When someone says Barry Bonds, they're telling you that they value peak performance. And when someone says Hank Aaron, they're telling you they value consistency. So maybe the greatest player of all time isn't the point. Maybe the real question is, what does the greatness actually mean? And until baseball can answer that, neither can I.